Hi, I'm Deb Geyer with the Quilters Hall of Fame. This fall of 2020, we have a wonderful exhibit of quilts to share. The quilts come to us from the American Quilt Study Group. Members of this group study quilts and then make a quilt inspired by what they learned from their studies. This particular exhibit focuses on solid color quilts with a regional focus. One of the artists is here to talk to us today about her quilt and studies. Susan Price Miller from Louisville, Kentucky, is going to share with us her quilt, Rising Sun. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Deb. Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you for taking the time to do this. We appreciate it. So I was wondering, why did you choose the quilt that you did for your inspiration quilt?
Well, first I want to say that I'll be talking about a Mississippi quilt and Mississippi families, but I never lived there. My parents are both from there. Their families go back to the first settlement of the state. But I did visit many times in the summer, and I lived then. Well, my father left to go to graduate school in Virginia, and then he got a job in West Virginia, and that's where I was born. Then I lived in Connecticut for my teen years and decided to go to college in Indiana, which was a very good decision. After that, I lived in Iowa for 40 years. So that's some background to where I'm coming from. As for why I chose this, in 2016, I had just donated the family quilt to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, that's abbreviated MDAH. And they were in the process of building new museums, two museums. In fact, that's the name of it, two Mississippi museums, one for history and one for the civil rights movement.
Oh.
So I knew the quilt would have state-of-the-art care since it was going to be this new museum. And so I donated it in 2016. And shortly after that, AQSG announced the study of solid color quilts. And I realized that this would fit in with my quilt and I could make something that I could keep for the family, make a small copy. I was kind of surprised that when I contacted the museum and told them I wanted to make a reproduction, that they were quite particular about giving me that permission. They had a whole form to fill out to give the reasons for wanting to do it. And they are concerned, I think, that some people do make copies of what the museum has in its collection and sell it for retail. That quilt had just been in my possession and then I couldn't do with it what I wanted to. I could find the fabrics quickly. I used Kona cotton. The red and the gold were just the right colors. And I did discover with that the fabric was a little bit heavier than usual quilt cotton. It seemed to be harder to piece the curves and to get the circle to come out even. And it was also harder to quilt through. I had to quilt by the piece.
The Kona cotton is what
you're saying. Through the Kona cotton. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
But the colors were just perfect. I tried to duplicate the original. I used 3/4 of the size. So if it was a 12-inch block, I made it 9 inches. Okay. And I copied everything else as closely as I could, except I didn't put the knots on. The original quilt had knots on the surface on both the front and the back. I think that was due to maybe my grandmother just learning how to quilt at that time.
Oh, okay. So the knots were the quilting knots, the knots from the quilting. Yes. Okay, it wasn't like a tied knot or something like that.
No.
Okay. How did you get the quilt? How did the quilt come to you?
I got it not from my mother, as you might guess, but from an aunt, my mother's unmarried sister, Virgily. Actually, in 1971, long before I got involved with quilting, she had decided she wanted me to have the quilt after she died. So she wrote up the history and wrote on there that it was to come to me after she died. But the story changed a little bit. In 1983, things changed for me. That was the year that I got converted to quilting. And just by chance, I heard about a conference that was going to be held at Iowa State in Ames, Iowa. I had done a little bit of quilting before that, some trial and error, but I just decided I would go to this, not realizing that the people there involved in it were the stars of the quilt world at the time and would be future Hall of Famers.
Wow.
I took the all quilted vest class with Fons and Porter, who were inducted last year.
Yes.
And I took a class about quilting and business with Marty Michelle, who
Wow.
was to be inducted this year and I will be inducted next year.
Yes.
Then Michael James had some of his early quilts in an exhibit there. Joyce Gross was promoting her Quilt Journal magazine. And most of all, Mary Barton displayed her collections of fabrics and blocks and magazines, ephemera. It took 2 large rooms to display all of her collections. And there is where I saw bound volumes of Ladies' Home Journal. And I looked through them and I realized that there were these old magazines that could be original sources, that were original sources for a lot of quilt research. And at that moment, I knew that's what I wanted to do, right there. And there's a picture that shows exactly where I was when that happened.
That's wonderful. Boy,
That was nice.
talk about being swept off your feet, huh?
Right. That was in 1983. And later that year, after my aunt heard about my joining the quilt world, my new interest in quilts, she decided to send me that family quilt right at that time,
Right.
not wait till she died.
Yeah.
Right there, I had a quilt with the provenance. She sent me its history. I had the provenance, and I had my first antique quilt to study.
Yes.
Of course, then you could not research genealogy online like you can now. So I just left it at what she had written. She did give me the story about how her mother, my mother's mother too, made this quilt, went to make a wedding present for her brother when he was getting married in 1894. And with help from Lula Roberts, had help from her mother, Jane, and they made the quilt. So the first quilt. She went on to make many more quilts later in life, but none of those exist. They were all used up.
Oh, okay.
Lula, my grandmother, was a very fine needle worker as well, very handy with the needle. She made baby dresses that were sold in a store in New Orleans. And she could also tat and sew and do just about anything with a needle. The history of the quilt, the provenance that my aunt gave me was that after the quilt was given to Lula's brother, William, and his wife, they got many more quilts for wedding presents. And so put this one aside and never used it.
Wow.
And finally decided to give it to Virgilie, who was William's niece, now my aunt. And I think Virgilie might have used it. She was a semi-invalid for many, many years. And it did show some signs of use, but then she put it away and finally gave it to me.
How nice that you have all the provenance on it and you know exactly who had it and who made it.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I didn't know a lot about my grandmother's family. That I've learned more recently what their life was like.
Oh, good. Good.
So having the provenance, then I went ahead and tried to study the pattern and find out where the pattern might have come from. It's basically a 8-pointed star made up of 8 diamonds, and the diamonds are divided in half by a curved line. And that just seems like a natural thing to me, a normal thing you might do with a plain diamond that you divide it with a straight line or the curve. but actually it doesn't seem to have been done that much, at least with the curve that faces toward the center.
Mm-hmm.
And in this quilt, once you put them all together without alternating colors, which you might do in alternating diamonds, you just get a circle in the middle. So it seems that it doesn't take advantage of the design opportunities that you would have with a diamond that's divided in half and you can change the colors. I did search Barbara Brackman for patterns that were called Rising Sun. She had 14 patterns named Rising Sun, none of which had any resemblance to this pattern. So she didn't have a history for it.
So the name Rising Sun came down from your grandmother.
Yes, it's the family name for the quilt.
Okay.
Mary Barton donated all of her ephemera, all of her materials, all of her notebooks to the History Museum in Des Moines. So I went there and started looking through her notebooks. And I did find that in Scribner's magazine of 1894, there was a big article with lots of quilt patterns in it, and 3 of them were said to have been made by a Biloxi Indian woman, a Native American woman from the Biloxi tribe, which is in the Louisiana area, close to the Mississippi border. And one of those was eight-pointed, a star, 8-pointed star with 8 diamonds. The center part of the diamond had curves going both ways. It's like an oval there in the middle of the diamond. But you do have those curves. You do have a curve which one faces towards the center, one faces out to form this oval. And that's as close as I've come. But this also gave me a clue that maybe there was some influence from the Native Americans in the area. Even if they didn't know any individuals, artifacts are turning up all the time, all over the state. So there might be some pottery or something with a design on it. And this sun, the circle with the points, is a very common motif in Native American culture. It's the sacred circle. So I'm thinking maybe there was some connection there. Then I came up with another idea, and this was just this morning. Perhaps my grandmother just used it as kind of a geometry exercise. Her schooling was very erratic, not so much because she couldn't go for some reason from the family, but the schools were erratic. They, in the area where they lived, which was the southernmost counties in Mississippi bordering on Louisiana, a mid-county, Pike County, the area right on the county line there between those two. They would just have schools, if someone could put one together for children in the neighborhood in an empty house or an empty cabin that might last for a while. It would be a one-room school. She must have done very well, though, whenever she did go to school. And her 8th grade was in an established school in a settlement called Riceville, which I could hardly find on a map. But she finished 8th grade and later did teach herself there. She taught, became the assistant to the principal in this Riceville school. So she taught until she was 26 years old. But I can see if she had any geometry in the 8th grade, up to the 8th grade, she could have figured out this pattern.
Yes.
The angles and the measurements for it. So it's another idea that just came to me. I haven't found any evidence at all that there was a quilting group in the area. This was a very sparsely populated, isolated area of small farms. The newspapers are very scanty there, and they did not include much about personal things going on, nothing about quiltings, quilt gatherings, or anything like that. So I have no evidence that that was going on, that would have been an influence.
Yes. Okay. How does it compare to other Mississippi quilts?
Well, I've used Mississippi Quilts by Mary Elizabeth Johnson
Uh-huh.
as a good source. Um, she shows at least a dozen quilts with triple piece sashes and borders, which the Rising Sun quilt has,
Yes.
with a 9-patch set in the corners with 9-patch cornerstones. So that's very typical. That aspect is very typical of other Mississippi quilts. How my grandmother and her mother knew this, I don't know. It's still a question. Another characteristic that Mary Johnson points out is that many of these Mississippi quilts use two solid colors of red, another color, and then the white. And in fact, in the book, there are 20 examples, about 20 examples of quilts from the fourth quarter of the 19th century that are these two colors or solid color quilts. And the curious thing is the reds are not faded. They are still bright. And you can see that just on the cover.
Yes. Yes.
So I wonder, where did they get fabrics like this at a time when a lot of red dyes faded out? We know that the
Mm-hmm.
synthetic dyes faded. So somewhere they had access to good dyed red fabric. I did learn that there was a big textile mill in Weston, Mississippi, which is 70 miles north of where my grandmother lived. It was a very large mill. It was the largest in the South for a while. And it supposedly produced a very fine cotton cloth. It won some prizes at the World's Fair in 1893 in Chicago.
Yeah.
But it's strange that the retail establishments did not advertise anything special. They hardly advertised any cloth for quilts. Their ads might say something like dress fabrics and notions. And that's all the mercantile would say in the newspaper. So I don't know exactly what those were. And the Mississippi Mill, that was called, it began as Wesson Mills and then changed the name to Mississippi Mills. I did find a big ad for them, and it listed sheetings and shirtings, which could be possibly the right weight for quilting. Nothing about their dyes. You would think that they would be promoting quality dyes if they did.
Quality dyes.
And of course, they only produce solid colors. They didn't have any print. No fabric was printed in the South until after 1900.
Yes.
It's all just solid colors and then woven solid colored threads.
Oh, okay.
So it's possible that fabrics did come from this mill, and it was sold in mercantile establishments. It's possible they got cuttings, that were leftovers. They might have been available to the public somehow. But somehow Mississippi quilters were able to get good red fabric. Another question that I continue to look for answers for, and I'm not sure I will find it, but keep trying. I still have these questions about the source of the fabrics and the products of the mills, and I'm going to keep working on it. This has been a good chance to review what I had done in the past and do a little more research. I especially learned more about my grandmother's family, and found a picture of the house that she lived in, which is looks like a cabin, very typical of structures at the time. She was on a small farm. This farm's grew a little bit of cotton. The land there was not good for cotton, really. A lot of sugar cane was grown there, and cattle and sheep were pastured. So those were some of the occupations of very little opportunity for a job. Mostly would be in the timber industry. That was another major thing in the counties there.
Okay.
But very limited opportunities.